In Chapter 26, Infections of the Nervous System, we want to look at a few important diseases that affect the nervous system. A little bit of terminology. As we discuss the nervous system, we will be looking at diseases that affect the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, as well as infections that affect the peripheral nervous system. It will include all of the nerves. With nervous system, we need to make sure we recognize a couple important terms, and they're shown here. Meningitis and encephalitis refer to inflammation of the meninges and the brain. The meninges are layers that surround the central nervous system that will help prevent infection. With a lot of our nervous system disorders, we're going to see some kind of common signs and symptoms. Blindness, hearing loss, learning disabilities, paralysis, and very often death, as these are serious infections. Bacterial meningitis is most commonly caused by these 3 different bacteria that you need to recognize the name of. The next infection, listeriosis, is caused by the bacteria Listeria monocytogenes. This infection causes stillbirth, neurological damage in children, and meningitis in adults. Listeria is transmitted by ingesting processed deli meat, undercooked hot dogs, canned meat, and dairy products. Our next infection we do need to spend just a few minutes discussing, and that is tetanus. Tetanus is caused by the bacteria Clostridium tetani. Clostridium tetani lives inside of the soil. The reason we don't all end up with a tetanus infection is we are protected from tetanus by the vaccination, the DTP vaccine. We've already looked at the D, diphtheria, and the P, pertussis. Now we're looking at the T for tetanus. Tetanus is a very, very horrific infection. A lot of us don't really know what tetanus is, and we'll think of things like lockjaw because we are very lucky in the United States that most of us are vaccinated against tetanus. With tetanus, the bacteria Clostridium tetani produces a neurotoxin that leads to spasms of the muscles. So people will have violent tremors until they begin paralyzed in this characteristic arched back position. Ultimately, death occurs with tetanus due to paralysis of the respiratory muscles. The next infection, botulism, is caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. Again, this is a common bacteria found in the soil. But when ingested, it can lead to some pretty nasty food poisoning, if you want to call it. But it can often affect respiratory muscles, and it can lead to death. An interesting thing about Clostridium botulinum is we have made good use of this toxin, not just to treat wrinkles, but we actually use it to treat headaches, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, and even excessive sweating. Our next disease in this chapter is leprosy. Leprosy is a slow progressing disease caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium leprae. Leprosy is caused by a bacteria that really prefers colder temperatures. So it mainly affects the extremities of the body, commonly the fingers, the feet, toes, the nose. When you initially see an infection of leprosy, you'll see this kind of more neural leprosy where you see discoloration. And then eventually it will progress into disfigurement of the body. Leprosy is not incredibly contagious, but long exposure to someone can lead to a transmission of Mycobacterium leprae. Poliomyelitis is an interesting viral infection because it has different effects on different people. There have been some people that had a viral infection of polio that had just some mild symptoms and didn't really do anything else to them. But in a very small number of cases, The paralytic form of polio can lead to crippling of the limbs and death due to paralysis of the respiratory muscles. Now this has a very interesting long history. This top picture you see here, this is the picture of the iron lung that was invented for polio patients to lay in to breathe for them. Now in the United States, we do vaccinate against poliomyelitis. Rabies is an interesting infection that kind of gets misconstrued a bit. Rabies is ends up ultimately leading to encephalitis. It is transmitted by a bite from an infected animal through the saliva. The most common animals that will transmit rabies will be bats, raccoons, very seldom, but it can be a dog or a cat. So initially, this viral infection is going to multiply inside of the skeletal muscle, but ultimately the rabies virus will move to the central nervous system. It has effects on the brain that lead to alternating periods of anger and then calm. One particular thing that's kind of interesting about rabies is it leads to a fear of water. If you think about it, if it's a dog that has rabies, why would the virus not want the animal to want water? Well, if it drinks water, it will mess up the virus's ability to multiply rapidly inside of the saliva and ultimately be transmitted. Just something a little bit interesting to think about. With rabies, this is going to be something that is treated, but the treatment and the anti-rabies vaccines are pretty painful, so they're not going to do that unless they have some confirmation that rabies is what's the issue. So I thought some of these were interesting pictures. Kind of take some of the stereotypes away. You see the most common cases of rabies in the United States are caused by foxes, skunks, bats, and raccoons. The poor little dogs who get the bad raps for it, they're down here at 1.2%, and a cow is right underneath it. And then this kind of shows you the location of rabies outbreaks in the United States. The next disease to take a look at are the different types of arboviral encephalitis. And this is not something that you need to memorize everything off of the table, but just in general, these are all going to be mosquito-borne viruses that lead to chills, headache, and fever, and ultimately a progression into a disease that is affecting your mental state. West Nile virus here in Mississippi is one that we probably talk the most about. Our last two are the last two diseases we will discuss this semester. These are both going to be protozoan infections. The first one is African trypanosomiasis. So similar to Chagas disease, this is also caused by a trypanosoma. It was transmitted by the tsetse fly. Infection with trypanosoma by the tsetse fly leads to just some kind of mild symptoms at first, fever, headaches, and then ultimately this will lead to coma. So a lot of times this is known as African sleeping sickness because it puts people to sleep. The last infection is an Amebic Meningoencephalitis caused by the Naegleria fowleri amoeba that lives in recreational fresh water. This is why you always hear you shouldn't swim inside of lakes and things like that that don't have a lot of flowing water in them. This particular amoeba will infect the nasal mucosa while you're swimming, and it penetrates, goes into the brain, and begins to feed on brain tissue. So this is the brain-eating amoeba. It is typically chronic and fatal.